Let's talk about the routing and view functions in Flask. But what routing means? Routing provides us a way to define the URL paths to access data from the server. It allows us to structure our URLs by using expressions. Even we can make our URLs dynamic to scale up with our applications. We can define a route by using the app.route decorator. It will take the string, which denotes our URL path, and a list of methods. If we don't provide a list of methods, get is the default one. The first argument, which is a string, also allows us to define expressions to make our URL dynamic. We will take a look shortly. Providing a list of accepted methods is a good way to build constraints into the route for a REST API endpoint, which only makes sense in specific contexts. As a tip, keep in mind that we can handle multiple routes with a single function by simply stacking additional route decorators above any route. Views are Python functions that refer to the content to be served at our defined URLs, whether that be a web page, an API response, etc. We can define the view functions below the routes. Let's implement a route to define URL along with methods. We will also implement view functions, explore the request and the response. Here's our basic Flask app which we created in our previous video. So let's define the route for a contact page. I will add the URL path as /contact. Then in methods, I will add get and post. When we add multiple methods, we definitely have to process the request according to the request method. For this purpose, we need to import the request from Flask. Then I will define the view function named contact. The names we choose for our view functions hold significance in Flask. Years of web development taught us that URLs tend to change all the time. Typically for business or SEO purposes, whereas the names of pages generally always stay the same. Flask recognizes this by giving us ways to move users around our app by referring to the names of views by essentially saying, redirect the user to whatever the URL for contact happens to be. Then we can use the method attribute of request to process the request according to the request method. So I will say if request.method equal to get, we will return a page. To return a Jinja template, we have to render it for this purpose. So we will call the render_template method and pass our template. Of course, we have to import it. We will continue this, but we have to explore some important concepts before that. So let's talk about the request-response cycle. It's really important to understand how Flask takes the request and gives the response back and what happens between these stages. So first, a client makes a request to the Flask server. When Flask receives a request from a client, it needs to make a few objects available to the view function that will handle it. A good example is the request object, which encapsulates the HTTP request sent by the client. The obvious way in which Flask could give a view function access to the request object is by sending it as an argument. When Flask invokes a view function, it expects its return value to be the response to the request. In most cases, the response is a simple string that is sent back to the client as an HTML page, and this cycle goes on. Great. Let's talk about dynamic routing. It provides a way to define URLs for real-world scenarios. Static route URLs can only get us so far, as modern-day web applications are rarely straightforward. When defining our route, values within caret brackets indicate a variable. This enables routes to be dynamically generated. Variables can be type-checked by adding a colon, followed by the data type constraint. Routes can accept different variable types, like string to accept any text without a slash, and it is the default one. Another one is integer to accept integers, and another one is float to accept numerical values containing decimal points, and the last one is path. It's similar to a string, but it accepts slashes. Great. There's 3 common ways to conclude a route. We can render a Jinja template with dynamic content. We can prepare and return a special response object, and we can also redirect the user to another URL. But keep in mind that views always conclude with a return statement. If it didn't provide that, it will raise an error. You're probably aware that Flask serves web pages via a built-in templating engine called Jinja. To render a Jinja template, we first must import a built-in Flask function called render_template. When a view function returns render_template, it's telling Flask to serve an HTML page to the user, which we generate via a Jinja template. Of course, this means we need to be sure our app has a templates directory. Render_template accepts one positional argument, which is the name of the template found in our template folders. In addition, we can pass values to our templates as keyword arguments. Redirect accepts a string, which will be the path to redirect the user to. This can be a relative path, absolute path, or even an external URL. If we are building an endpoint intended to respond with information to be used programmatically, serving page templates isn't what we need. Instead, we should look to the make_response. Make_response allows us to serve up information while also providing a status code, and also allows us to attach headers to the said response. We can even use make_response with render_template if we want to serve up templates with specific headers. Most of the time, make_response is used to provide information in the form of JSON objects. There are different arguments we can pass to make_response. The first is the body of our response. It's usually a JSON object or a simple message. Next is a 3-digit integer representing the HTTP response code we provide to the client. Finally, we can pass response headers if we want. Let's implement the response object in our view with the body, status code, and headers. First, I will import the make_response. Then inside the contact view function, if the request method is get, I will call make_response and add a simple text as body. Then we will add a status code like 200 and save it in response variable. Now we can bind the headers. You can put the information you want there. Then simply return that response object. Clearly, there's a lot we can do with routes in Flask. The beauty of Flask development is the flexibility to build meaningful software immediately, with the ability to add functionality when the time is right, as opposed to upfront.